A chance encounter at a daycare leads David Sam to love, family, and a life he never knew he was missing, as Elena Ben helps him open his heart to trust commitment and the true meaning of happiness. David Sam's morning was already a disaster. The shrill ring of his phone had yanked him awake at 5:30 a.m., his assistant reminding him about a critical board meeting later that day. Between last-minute report reviews and responding to urgent emails, he barely had time to think, let alone get his 3-year-old daughter, Nora, ready for daycare. Now, navigating the congested streets of New York in his sleek black Audi, David stole a glance at Nora in the rearview mirror. She hummed a soft tune, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. "All right, sweetheart, we're here," he said, pulling up to the daycare. Nora blinked at the unfamiliar building, her big brown eyes filled with confusion. "But Daddy, this isn't my school." David barely registered her words. His mind was already racing ahead to an important conference call starting in exactly 10 minutes. He unbuckled her seatbelt and knelt in front of her, smoothing a stray curl from her forehead. "I know, baby. We're trying a new place today. You'll have so much fun," he assured her. Nora hesitated, staring at the bright, colorful sign that read Little Wonders Daycare. This wasn't her usual daycare. "What if I don't like it?" she asked in a small voice. David smiled and kissed her forehead. "You'll be fine, I promise." With that, he handed her off to a waiting staff member and hurried back to his car, completely unaware he had just made a huge mistake. Elena Ben had always believed that children had a keen sense of people's true nature. The moment Nora Sam stepped into Little Wonders Daycare, gripping her stuffed rabbit like a lifeline, Elena knew something was wrong. The first red flag? Nora wasn't on the student list. The second? The man who had dropped her off had practically sprinted out the door without double-checking a single detail. Frowning, Elena knelt to Nora's level. "Hey there, sweetheart. What's your name?" Nora hesitated before whispering, "Nora Sam." Elena's heart clenched at the nervousness in the little girl's voice. "Well, Nora, it looks like we weren't expecting you today. Do you know your teacher's name?" Nora shook her head, holding her rabbit tighter. Elena sighed and pulled out the emergency contact list, dialing the guardian number. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. This was exactly why she disliked dealing with high-profile parents. They always assumed someone else would handle everything for them. Softening her tone, she said, "How about this? You stay with me today, and we'll figure things out when your daddy comes back, okay?" Nora hesitated, then nodded slowly. And so, Elena spent the entire day with Nora, helping her with arts and crafts, reading stories, and sitting with her during lunch when she refused to eat alone. By the afternoon, Nora had opened up, laughing and playing with the other kids. But Elena wasn't looking forward to the confrontation with a man who had abandoned his daughter without a second thought. David strode into Little Wonders Daycare with a mix of urgency and guilt. His last meeting had barely ended when he noticed a voicemail from an unknown number. "Mr. Sam, this is Elena Ben from Little Wonders Daycare. Your daughter was dropped off at our facility by mistake this morning. I've been trying to reach you all day. Please call me back immediately." His stomach dropped. How had this happened? His assistant had confirmed Nora's daycare drop-off the night before. As he stepped inside, his sharp gaze swept across the room until it landed on a woman standing next to Nora. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was a mix of unimpressed and challenging. David immediately recognized the frustration in her eyes. She wasn't happy with him. Neither was Nora. His daughter pouted the moment she saw him. "Daddy, you put me in the wrong school." Exhaling, David knelt beside her. "I know, sweetheart. That was Daddy's mistake." "I'm sorry," Nora huffed, crossing her tiny arms. "I like it here." Before David could respond, the woman, Elena, cleared her throat. "You must be David Sam," she said, her voice even but edged with disapproval. The man who didn't bother answering his phone all day. His head snapped up, brows furrowing. "I had back-to-back meetings." Elena didn't flinch. "And I had a scared little girl who didn't know why she was here. Tell me, Mr. Sam, what exactly was so important that you couldn't check your phone when your daughter needed you?" An unfamiliar pang of guilt settled in David's chest. "I appreciate you taking care of her," he said, keeping his voice controlled. But this was an accident. It won't happen again. Elena raised an eyebrow. No, it won't. Because next time, I won't just call. I'll report it to Child Services. David clenched his jaw. No one talked to him like that. But before he could fire back, Nora reached for Elena's hand, looking up at her with complete trust. And that's when something shifted inside David. Nora was comfortable with this woman. More than that, she liked her. For the first time in years, David Sam found himself at a complete loss for words. And Elena Ben? She had just become the one woman he wouldn't be able to ignore. The moment David carried Nora out of Little Wonder's daycare, his daughter made her feelings very clear. "Daddy, I want to come back here tomorrow," she declared. Nora's small hands clung to David's suit sleeve as he secured her in the car seat. He frowned, realizing the mistake. "Nora, this isn't your daycare. Your school is across town. But I like it here," she pouted. "Miss Elena is nice." David sighed, already feeling a headache coming on. "I'm sure she is, but you have friends at your real daycare." Nora shook her head, her curls bouncing. "Miss Elena played with me and read my favorite book twice." David resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He still wasn't sure what to make of Elena Ben. Yes, she had taken care of Nora in his absence, but she had also confronted him in a way no one else ever had. Yet, something about the way Nora clung to the idea of returning gave him pause. That night, as he tucked Nora into bed, she gazed up at him with those big brown eyes, the ones that always made him weak. "Please, Daddy," she whispered. "Just one more day." David ran a hand through his hair and sighed. Just one more day. What was the worst that could happen? The next morning, David found himself back at Little Wonder's daycare, leading an excited Nora through the doors. Elena looked up from where she knelt beside a group of toddlers, surprise flickering in her expression. "Back so soon?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. David straightened his tie. Nora insisted. Elena smirked. "Smart girl." He opened his mouth to respond, maybe with a sarcastic remark, but Nora had already run off to play, leaving them alone. Silence stretched between them before David finally spoke, his voice measured. "I'm letting her stay for a few days." Elena crossed her arms. "And you trust me with that?" David's jaw tightened. Did he? "I trust my daughter," he said simply. "And she seems to trust you." Something unreadable passed through Elena's expression. Fair enough. For the next few days, David kept his distance. He arrived at the same time every morning, dressed in sharp suits, offering only a polite nod to Elena before leaving. But he watched, always watched, and what he saw began to shift his perception of her. One afternoon, he arrived early to pick up Nora and found Elena sitting in a reading circle with the children. Nora was curled up beside her, completely engrossed as Elena read Goodnight Moon. But it wasn't just the reading, it was the way Elena engaged each child, the warmth in her voice, the way she made every child feel seen. David stood frozen near the doorway, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. When the story ended, Nora spotted him and beamed. "Daddy," she called, running toward him. Elena looked up too, meeting his gaze. For the first time since they met, David didn't see defiance in her eyes. He saw understanding. And that realization shook him more than he cared to admit. David wasn't sure why he arrived at the daycare earlier than usual. He told himself it was just a gap in his schedule, a coincidence. But as he stepped inside, pausing at the doorway, he knew it had nothing to do with time. It had everything to do with her. Across the room, Elena sat cross-legged on the rug, surrounded by children. Her voice was soft and animated as she read Where the Wild Things Are. The kids hung on every word, their faces full of wonder. And there, nestled against her side, was Nora, her tiny hands gripping Elena's sweater as if she had always belonged there. David should have interrupted, should have announced his presence. But he didn't. Instead, he watched. He watched as Elena brushed a stray curl from Nora's face, her touch gentle. He watched as Nora leaned into her warmth, utterly content. A warmth spread through his chest, something foreign, something dangerous. For years, David had kept his world controlled and orderly. There was no room for distractions, no room for emotions. But something was shifting, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. A week later, it happened again. David arrived to find Nora fast asleep on Elena's lap, her tiny body curled against her, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Elena absent-mindedly stroked Nora's hair, whispering a lullaby. For a moment, David didn't move. He had spent the past 4 years raising Nora alone, ensuring she had everything she needed, except this: the warmth of a mother's embrace, the security of being held. His throat tightened. He had convinced himself Nora was fine without it. But seeing her there, resting so peacefully in Elena's arms, he knew he had been lying to himself. And for the first time in years, David felt something he never allowed himself to feel: longing. David wasn't a man who let personal matters distract him. But something about Elena lingered in his thoughts. The way she was with Nora, the way she carried herself, the depth in her eyes he couldn't quite understand. One evening, after putting Nora to bed, he did something he never did. He looked her up. It didn't take long to find an old news article. Tragic car accident claims lives of Ben family. Only daughter survives. David stared at the screen, his pulse steady, but his mind spinning. Elena had lost her entire family in a single moment. And yet, instead of breaking, she had built a life caring for children, offering them the love she had lost. Something twisted inside him. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more: the weight of her past, or the realization that he was allowing himself to care. David had spent years keeping his emotions locked away, ensuring his world remained professional, distant. Love, real, all-consuming love, was a liability. And Elena? She was the greatest threat to that belief. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He pulled away. Elena noticed immediately the change in his demeanor, the way his gaze lingered on her less, the sharper edge in his voice. At first, she thought she imagined it, but as the days passed, she knew this wasn't in her head. David Sam was pulling away, and the worst part? She had no idea why. One rainy afternoon, fate intervened. David's car broke down right outside the daycare. Inside, Elena was finishing up for the day when she spotted him standing in the rain, frustration clear on his face as he inspected the engine. Without a second thought, she grabbed an umbrella and stepped outside. "You'll catch pneumonia if you keep standing there like that," she called out. David looked up, rain dripping from his dark hair, his expensive suit already soaked. "Car trouble?" she asked, tilting her head. He exhaled. Apparently. She hesitated for only a moment before offering, "Come inside, at least until the tow truck arrives." He looked like he wanted to refuse, but after glancing at the stormy sky, he sighed and followed her in. Inside, the daycare was quiet, the children long gone for the day. Elena handed him a towel and a steaming cup of tea. "I don't drink tea," David muttered. Elena smirked, sitting across from him. "You do now." For the first time in weeks, they sat together without barriers, without tension. And for the first time, David found himself not wanting to leave. David Sam had always prided himself on control over his business, his time, his emotions. But ever since that rainy afternoon in the daycare, Elena Ben had thrown his carefully built world into chaos. He found himself thinking about her at odd moments, wondering what she was doing, how her day was going, what she looked like when she wasn't surrounded by children, but just being herself. And that terrified him. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. He had structured his life to be free of personal entanglements. Nora was the only exception. So David did what he always did when something threatened his carefully built walls. He pulled away. His greetings became shorter, his eye contact fleeting. If he had once lingered for a few extra minutes to watch Nora play, now he was in and out in under a minute. And the worst part? He could see how much it hurt Elena. Elena wasn't naive. She noticed the change immediately. The warmth between them was gone. The quiet smiles had vanished. But she didn't confront him because deep down, she knew. David Sam wasn't running from her. He was running from himself. Elena had never been one to chase people who didn't want to stay. Life had already taken everyone she had loved from her in one cruel instant. So when David started keeping his distance, she didn't fight it. She didn't demand an explanation. She simply accepted it. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Because somewhere along the way, without meaning to, without realizing it, she had fallen for him. She had fallen for the way he looked at Nora, not just as a father, but as a man who wanted to give his daughter the world. She had fallen for the way his voice softened when he said thank you that night in the daycare, as if kindness was something foreign to him, but precious all the same. She had fallen for the man who hid his heart behind steel walls, but, for a brief moment, had let her peek inside. And now he was shutting her out. So Elena made her choice. She pulled away too. She stopped staying late in the afternoons when she knew David might arrive. She avoided his gaze whenever he did come. If he wanted distance, she would give it to him. But someone else noticed a shift. Nora, the little girl, was sharp, perceptive in a way most adults underestimated. "Miss Elena?" Nora asked one afternoon, gripping the hem of Elena's sweater. "Why doesn't Daddy smile at you anymore?" The question hit Elena harder than she expected. She forced a smile, kneeling to meet Nora's innocent gaze. "Oh, sweetheart, your daddy's just very busy." Nora pouted. "But he used to laugh when he saw you. And now he just looks sad." Elena's heart squeezed. She wanted to tell Nora the truth, that sometimes adults made things more complicated than they needed to, that sometimes fear got in the way of happiness. But Nora was just a child. And Elena was just the woman who had fallen for a man who wasn't ready to love her back. David had spent his life making calculated decisions, but as he sat on the edge of Nora's bed that night, tucking her in, he realized he had never felt more lost. Nora clutched her stuffed rabbit close, blinking up at him sleepily. "Daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart." She hesitated before asking, "Do you love Miss Elena?" David's breath caught. His entire body tensed, as if she had just exposed a truth he wasn't ready to face. "Why would you ask that?" he said carefully. Nora pouted. "Because when you used to see her, you smiled. But now you don't. And she looks sad too." David exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. This was his 4-year-old daughter, the one person who saw straight through him, even when he refused to see himself. And she was right. David had been avoiding the truth, avoiding his feelings, because the truth was he did love Elena. He loved the way she cared for Nora. He loved the way she challenged him. He loved the way her laughter made the world feel lighter. But most of all, he loved who he was when he was with her. And he had been a fool for running away. Leaning down, he pressed a soft kiss to Nora's forehead. "Thank you, baby girl." "For what?" she yawned. "For reminding me what really matters." The next morning, David didn't go to work. Instead, he went straight to Little Wonder's daycare. The moment he stepped inside, the room went quiet. The children playing near the reading area froze, their wide eyes locking onto him. And then he saw her. Elena stood near a group of kids, reading a picture book aloud. When she looked up and saw him, her expression shuddered instantly. "David," she said cautiously, closing the book. "What are you doing here?" Every instinct told him to be careful, that this wasn't the time or place. But he had wasted too much time already. "I need to talk to you," he said. "In private," Elena added. David's voice was firm as he stopped Elena from stepping away. "No," he said. "I need to say this here." Gasps echoed through the daycare as children and staff looked on, but David didn't care. He took a step closer, his voice raw with emotion. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of what it meant to care about you. Afraid of what would happen if I let you in." Elena's breath caught. David swallowed hard, his voice softening. "You were right, Elena. I was running, convincing myself that keeping my distance was the safest choice." His gaze locked onto hers. "But then I realized something." She swallowed. "What?" "I'm more afraid of living without you," he confessed, his world narrowing to just her. Silence filled the room. Elena's lips parted as if she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. But David meant every word. "I love you, Elena," he said, finally speaking the truth he'd been too scared to admit. "And I don't want to run anymore." A single tear slid down her cheek, but then, finally, she smiled. For the first time in weeks, she let herself feel everything: the fear, the longing, the love. Looking at David, so open, so vulnerable, she knew this wasn't just a man letting down his walls. He was the man she had been waiting for all along. With a shaky breath, she whispered, "You idiot." David blinked. "I what?" She laughed through her tears, stepping forward and wrapping her arms around him. "You love me," she murmured against his chest. He held her tightly. "Yeah," he breathed. "I really do." For the first time, David Sam knew exactly where he belonged, right there in Elena's arms. The cheerful laughter of children filled Little Wonder's daycare, blending with the golden afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Elena stood in the playroom, watching toddlers build a castle out of wooden blocks. This daycare had been her passion, her life's work, and now it was home in more ways than one. "Miss Elena, Daddy's here." Nora's excited voice rang across the room. Elena turned just as David stepped inside. Dressed in a crisp white shirt with his sleeves rolled up, he looked as confident as ever. But his eyes held something softer now, something only she got to see. Nora grabbed Elena's hand, tugging eagerly. "Come on, Daddy has a surprise." Elena chuckled, letting the little girl pull her forward. "A surprise?" David stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, a smirk playing at his lips. "Nora, sweetheart, do you think you can give me a moment alone with Miss Elena?" Nora giggled but nodded. "Okay, but don't take too long. I want to see the surprise too." She ran off to rejoin her friends, leaving Elena and David standing amidst colorful walls and tiny chairs. Elena crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. "All right, Sam, what's going on?" David took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee. The daycare fell silent. Little eyes turned toward them, whispering excitedly. David pulled out a small velvet box and flipped it open, revealing a sparkling diamond ring. "Elena Ben," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "A year ago, I walked into this daycare thinking I was just dropping my daughter off at the wrong place. But I found the right place, the right person." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "You changed everything," David continued. "You showed me what it means to love, to trust, to build something real. And I don't want to spend another day without you." He exhaled, looking up at her with pure, unguarded love. "So, Elena, will you marry me?" A collective gasp rippled through the daycare. Children, teachers, even Nora, all held their breath, waiting. Elena let out a shaky laugh, covering her mouth with one hand before nodding furiously. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, David. 1,000 times yes." Cheers erupted as David slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms. Nora practically tackled him in a hug. "We're going to be a family." David kissed the top of his daughter's head, his gaze locking onto Elena's. "We already are." And for the first time, David Sam knew he had everything. A year later, waves crashed gently against the shore as Elena leaned into David's shoulder, their fingers intertwined. Their wedding had been a beautiful, intimate ceremony by the ocean, surrounded by the people they loved most. Now, they sat on the back porch of their beach house, watching Nora chase seagulls along the sand. Elena placed a hand on her growing belly. David noticed instantly, turning to her with a soft smile. "He's kicking," Elena whispered. David placed his hand over hers, feeling the tiny movement. His throat tightened with emotion. "A son," he murmured. "We're having a son." Elena smiled. "A little brother for Nora. A perfect addition to our family." David kissed her temple, pulling her closer. He had spent years believing love was a weakness, that opening his heart would only lead to pain. But now, with Elena in his arms, their daughter laughing in the distance, and their unborn child moving beneath his palm, he knew he had never been more wrong. Because this was everything. David Sam once thought he had it all: wealth, power, success. But it took one wrong daycare, one extraordinary woman, and one loving daughter to show him what truly mattered. Elena Ben never imagined that a simple mistake would lead her to the love of her life. But love has a way of finding us when we least expect it, in the laughter of a child, in the warmth of an unexpected embrace, and in the quiet moments where hearts learn to trust again. Together, David, Elena, and Nora became the family they never knew they were missing. And in the end, love didn't just change their lives, it completed them. If this story touched your heart, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Hope Stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss another uplifting tale. Because love no matter how unexpectedly it begins, always finds its way.